Hello, Dr. Gordon Pershey and classmates. I'm going to be presenting my passport project, so let me upload it for you guys. Give me 1 second. Okay, perfect. So for my passport project, I chose to pick a memoir about someone who immigrated to the United States and wrote a book about it. Well, that's what a memoir is. And then analyze it. So I chose the book Funny in Farsi, a memoir of growing up Iranian in America, and it's written by Fairuza Dumas. And this project is by B. Selma Tahat. So I hope it's not just Dr. Gordon Pershey watching this. I hope some of my other classmates have chosen to watch this as well. I picked this book specifically because Iranian culture is very similar to Arab culture, and I thought I'd be able to relate to it myself and have my own personal input as well, because I love to give that, as always, as many know. But I did very much enjoy this book. So this is the book here, Funny in Farsi. This book is about Miss Fairuza. She immigrated to the United States with her mom and siblings. Her dad actually got his education here in the United States in Southern California. Well, he got it in Texas, but they lived in California. So he was in the United States first, and then they end up following him. So they lived 2 years in the United States, and then they moved back to Iran for a little bit, and then they came back. So it kind of goes back and forth. It's a little confusing, but they do end up staying in the United States. So that is very interesting. And she talks about school life. She talks about different things that her dad teaches her and the way he looks at things compared to the way her mom looks at things, and there's things just because her dad was educated here compared to her mom not being educated here, things of that nature. But again, they both obviously still struggle because they are still born and raised in Iran. And they obviously all struggle being that they are Iranians living in America. So just to give a little bit of background on Iran, I am not too familiar with the whole history on Iran compared to other Middle Eastern countries. But she does delve into it a little bit. She talks about, obviously, the British rule before the Shah. It's typical. The British did rule quite a few. They colonized quite a few countries back in their day, so that's not too uncommon. And then the Shah's rule, obviously. But the main point that I want to discuss that she talks about in the book is the way she was treated before/during 1972, which is when she first moved to the United States, compared to after the fact. So when she first moved to the United States in 1972, people didn't know what Iran was, but they still treated her kindly. They asked her lots of questions about Iran. You know, they kind of made those stereotypical type questions like, do you guys ride camels? Do you guys eat camel? You know, things of that nature that are stereotypical. And while they do come off as offensive, they're not offensive compared to things that we hear today, right? So, you know, she made light of comments like that and would actually teach people, and people were intrigued. People were very inclusive, welcoming, invite her over, have her sleep over, come over, things like that, and they were very kind. However, unfortunately, there were some incidences in Iran where the Shah, I believe, Iranian government rule at the time did take some American hostages. And so when she came back to Iran, her and her family were treated differently. It was more of, what are you doing in our country? You guys don't like us. Why? Since you guys are holding us hostage, get out of our country, go stay in your country. You guys don't like us. That kind of negative mentality, because unfortunately people do tend to, when they see one person from a community or group do something, they tend to generalize the entire community, right? And sometimes people, based on their own judgments and things, they don't know why things are happening, they don't know why things are going on. Sometimes the media isn't always as truthful as we think, and we have to do our own research and our own background to know why the things that are happening, so that we don't go out and say offensive things like that. So that's just kind of a little background as to why certain things from a cultural perspective may have been happening to Fairuza and her family in this story, and some of the cultural references that I may mention. So some semantic and grammatical features are kind of things that I wanted to point out that she mentions and that I noticed in the book. So she mentioned sloppy Joe and tater tots. That was something that was new to both of her parents because her dad spent most of the time in his dorm studying. So he didn't know what either were. She was the one going to school. So she's coming home talking to them about sloppy Joes and tater tots, these foods that are completely foreign to them, right? Let's Make a Deal and The Price is Right. Her mom's staying at home all day watching these shows. She's learning the majority of English from these shows, and infomercials as well, which mainly getting the best deal on things from those compared to actually learning English from those. Some pragmatics that we deal with here, expressions like elbow grease. There's a scene in the book, or a part in the book, where they have a handyman come over and they ask him, to help get the stain out, and he's like, you're just gonna have to use a little elbow grease. So they go to like Home Depot or Lowe's or something, and they're asking them for elbow grease, and they get the manager and they're all laughing at them, and they explain to them the situation, and then she ends the chapter with explaining that she learns that was a wild goose chase, right? So she's learning these different pragmatics features here. And then her parents say to her that they don't understand why teenagers want to be cool just so they can be hot, right? Like, it kind of seems to be an idiom to them than it does to be a pragmatic relation. So going to the cultural considerations. So me being a practicing Muslim, I thought it was very interesting that this author mentions that they were practicing Muslims, just because I personally, most of the Iranians and such that I have known over the several years, especially the ones, and most Iranians that I know, they are from California. That tends to be where a big majority of the community does immigrate to. They're either Jewish or Muslim faith background, but they choose not to practice. So I thought it was very cool and interesting that this was from an author that does choose to practice. But she references how her dad chooses not to practice certain things, but he is very knowledgeable on the faith. So I really appreciated that, because sometimes we might see people who choose not to practice the little things, right? But they're very knowledgeable about the faith. So that goes with any religion or practice. So another reason why you shouldn't generalize or assume things about people's culture or background. And I've seen that happen in these very school buildings, whether it be college or school, right? It just happened the other day. A teacher made a comment saying that, talking about the difference between tolerance and acceptance, or something of that nature. And she was saying how acceptance is adopting the culture. And she was saying how she couldn't necessarily adopt Middle Eastern culture because Middle Eastern culture, some Middle Eastern cultures don't allow women to drive, right? And that's totally incorrect, because that was one country, Saudi Arabia, and that was based on government. That was a law. They didn't have women drive, and they got rid of that law. So now that there's no country, no Middle Eastern country that does that, to my knowledge. And that has nothing to do with culture. That's government law. So things are getting mixed up there, right? When people are making comments like that, and especially professionals, they should know better. So just understanding that people may be knowledgeable on things, whether it's their faith or their culture, whatever, but they choose not to practice certain things. In this case of Fairuza, it was her dad being very knowledgeable on his faith, talking about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, talking about, the Quran, but then still choosing to eat pork, right? So very important. And then I thought it was very interesting. I did not know this, that Iranians are considered an Indo-European people. I always considered them Persian, which she said is true. And she said the language of Farsi can be referred to as Persian as well, but they are not considered Arabs, which I knew, obviously, because they don't speak Arabic, so they're not considered Arab. Excuse me. But they are still considered Middle Eastern because Iran is considered to be in the Middle East. I also wanted to refer to another cultural consideration. A lot of times people think America is the safest place on earth, but recently, especially over the past several years, I feel like America is no different than the countries that are made to seem like the scariest place on earth, right? So she mentions how fearful her dad is for children, kidnapping and things like that, how he's taught her since the day she's born what to do in any situation where she's not with him or with someone from the family, because they come from a town in Iran where it is extremely safe. You can walk anywhere by yourself. You can do anything by yourself, where in America, that's not really the case in a lot of places. Even in my hometown, I don't know if I would want to walk just anywhere by myself, maybe my neighborhood, but not just anywhere, right? So that's something referred to gun laws. People think Middle Eastern countries are these big bad places with bombs and guns and whatnot. But guess what? The only people that are allowed to have guns in most Middle Eastern countries, and specifically she refers to Iran, is people of armed forces, military, police. People, civilians are not allowed to even go near one. However, in the United States, that's not the case. So these generalizations, things like that, obviously, I'm not saying America's bad or Iran is bad or whatever. I'm saying that we often stereotype a lot of these countries. And then I wanted to mention, she mentions it a few times in the book, the oldest child being the interpreter, translator. I personally experienced this. I'm the oldest child and I'm also the daughter. So I was oftentimes reading legal documents for my father, reading medical documents for my father. I mean, my dad has me as his emergency contact on everything, and not my stepmom. And my stepmom, she speaks very good English and she knows everything, but he just is so dependent on me from all these years that he has that reliance on me. That's it. He puts me as everything, because I've been doing that for such a young age, helping him with stuff. And I made the comment tough because her mom makes a comment when people would say to Fairuza, like, oh, you're such a smart little girl helping your mom translating. She said, oh, Americans are impressed by everything. So that's kind of a cultural thing as well, her kind of having that. And I think that's to mask her feeling guilty that she can't, be the mom and take care of herself, take care of her daughter, right? So just something to consider also, and that'll go into when I refer to SLPs. So just some phonological articulation as well as some grammatical things mainly made by the mother. She takes the glide W and the voiced and voiceless TH and she replaces it with the fricative V, typically in the frontal position, So they're from a town called Whittier, I believe, and she calls it Whittier. Obviously, this is most likely because they either don't have these sounds in the Farsi language, or they probably don't have them in the frontal positions often. That's what I'm gonna guess, because in Arabic we have these sounds, so I'm assuming in Farsi they most likely have. I've heard the Farsi language spoken and I'm pretty sure I've heard it. They probably just don't have them in the frontal positions often. So like instead of Whittier, she says Whittier, like I mentioned, and then instead of she says va, right? Then she says a lot of paragraphs without verbs. That's kind of a more grammatical thing, referring to everything as it. So she'll go on a tangent. It. You don't know if she's talking about Fairuza. You don't know if she's talking about the dad. You don't know if she's talking about the plant. You don't know what she's talking about, right? So it's kind of hard to keep track. And a cultural thing is that she probably goes on these big tangents, right? So that's something that kind of is hard to keep track of. And then Fairuza mentions how in the English language we're missing spices from the cabinet. So we don't have a lot of guttural sounds in the English language to add flavor, like the kh and the gh, that you hear in Farsi, Arabic, Hebrew, even a lot of those Asian, closer like Asian European countries, they have kind of sounds like that are not present in the English language at all. So I thought that was very interesting. She made that comment. I like the spice reference. So SLP consideration. So given all these things that Fairuza mentions, these are things you want to consider when you're working with ELL children, the family dynamic. Like I mentioned about Fairuza's mom being a little bit tough like that. You know what I'm saying? She might, you know, when you're SLP working with a mother who needs someone to translate for her, oftentimes kind of seeing if you can bring mom in sometimes and not necessarily give therapy with mom, but maybe have mom kind of sitting on the side, seeing what you're doing with the child, and if the child needs therapy, first of all, because again, that's a misdiagnosis that oftentimes happens. Just because the child is an English second language does not necessarily mean that they need speech therapy. But if they do need speech therapy, kind of having that mom on the side where she can see kind of what's going on. And also, if she doesn't need speech therapy, but that you notice, kind of let that counseling aspect come in, where, you know, just offering any type of assistance, seeing if there's anything needed for the family, if they need anything, if they want to just take an English course, seeing if, you know, letting them know, hey, there's churches down the street. I know you're Muslim, but it has nothing to do with faith. You can go to the church down the street and take English classes for free, and they will not discriminate. You know, typically those places hopefully are, you know, meant to be welcoming to everyone. Understanding the cultural differences, if that child is in speech therapy, you know, maybe there's a reason that, you know, only certain person they can only come a certain amount of time, or they might be late sometimes for some reason. Maybe they have things going on. Fairuza came from a big household, maybe a lot of responsibility. She doesn't talk too much about that, but maybe a lot of responsibility is put on her in the household because she's the only daughter of the family. So just various needs of that nature, kind of being considerate of that, understanding that, you know, if there's homework being sent home and maybe it's not getting in right on time, maybe she's needing help and mom doesn't understand or dad doesn't understand. Seeing if, you know, maybe if speech isn't needed, we need to get an IEP involved, even if it's not for speech, if it's for something else, just for these other cultural needs, and understanding that because of certain cultural aspects, certain things may or may be allowed in a certain way, if that makes sense. So these are things we all have to kind of take with a grain of salt and make sure, not that we don't ask, but that we actually do ask, but we ask in a way that's respectful, because if we don't ask, then we don't know. I'm a big believer in that, but it's all about how you ask. So I think that's very important. And that concludes my presentation for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this book. It was a very quick read, 200 pages. I really enjoyed it, and I would definitely recommend this book to anybody. And I think it's a good way to kind of kickstart just learning about other cultures. So I really appreciate taking the time to listen, and thank you all so much.